You hear Viking, and you think raids and treasure. Dragon ships cutting through North Sea swells, warriors with axes and gold arm rings. But victory feasts, war brides, the chronicles go quiet there. What happened after the shields stopped clashing gets buried under heroic poetry and sanitized sagas. The uncomfortable truth sits in laws, graves, and slave market records from Dublin to Constantinople. What Vikings did to captured women after battle wasn't just brutal, it was systematic. And the aftermath of those victory celebrations left marks in medieval law codes that nobody talks about. The war bride wasn't some romantic prize. She was livestock, human currency. And what happened to her after the mead horns emptied tells a story darker than any blood eagle. If you value documented Viking and Norse era history like this, subscribe. It's the best way to support our work. Also comment from which city you're hearing this from. This script is researched and factual, using sources from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and Ibn Fadlan's accounts. Now back to the story. 971. Stamford Bridge isn't the end you know about. This is a different Stamford Bridge, Yorkshire. King Edgar's men scattered Norse raiders along the Derwent. 43 ships burned. But the real prize isn't silver, it's women. Captives from the settlements they hit on the way inland. The Northumbrian Chronicle lists them as feminine captiva, female captives. 18 names survive, ages given as young or of breeding years. The victory feast lasts 3 days. What happens next isn't in the heroic poems. War brides follow a pattern across every documented Viking raid from the 8th century forward. First comes selection. Not all captured women qualify. The chroniclers are specific about this. They need to be young enough to bear children, but old enough to survive rough handling. The Dublin Annals from 974 put the age range between 12 and 25. Older women get sold immediately to the slave markets. Younger ones die too easily on the ships. War brides occupy this narrow band where they're valuable alive. The selection happens fast. Battle ends at dawn. Ships prep to leave by noon. No time for ceremonies or negotiations. Ibn Fadlan describes the process among the Russ he meets on the Volga in 922. 3 men examine each woman. They check teeth, feel muscle tone in arms and legs, and inspect what he calls the breeding signs. Women who pass get marked with red ochre on their foreheads. The mark means property. It also means they survive the next part. Loading the ships comes next. War brides don't ride free. The Gokstad ship excavation shows how they traveled. Iron rings bolted into the deck planks. Each ring fits 1 ankle shackle. 24 rings. Per ship means 24 captives, maximum. The chains are short enough that they can't stand upright, long enough that they can shift position when the ship rolls. The Norwegian Maritime Museum tested the setup with volunteers. After 6 hours, circulation problems start. After 12 hours, permanent nerve damage begins. Dublin to Bergen takes 4 days minimum in good weather. The victory feast doesn't happen on the ships. Too cramped. Too dangerous with chained captives aboard. It happens at the first safe harbor, usually an island base or friendly settlement. The Orkney saga describes one feast after a successful raid on the Scottish coast in 988. 47 warriors, 18 war brides. The celebration lasts 2 days. The saga doesn't detail what happens to the women during those 2 days. Other sources fill the gaps. Adam of Bremen writes about similar feasts he witnessed secondhand through informants in the late 11th century. The war brides get distributed before the serious drinking starts, not randomly, by rank and contribution to the battle. The Jarl gets first pick, ship captains get second choice. Regular warriors divide the rest by lot casting. The women have no say. They often don't speak the language anyway. The whole process takes maybe an hour. Then the real celebration begins. What follows isn't marriage in any sense medieval Christians would recognize. The legal scholar Regis Boyer analyzed surviving law codes from Iceland, Norway, and Denmark. None of them recognize unions between free men and war brides as legitimate marriage. The children from these unions have no inheritance rights. The women themselves remain property, not wives. They can be sold, traded, or killed without legal consequence. The only restriction is that killing another man's war bride counts as property damage, not murder. The feast itself serves multiple purposes beyond celebration. It's a bonding ritual for the war band. Shared victory, shared rewards, shared responsibility for what happens next. The Ibn Fadlan account is specific about the rituals he observes. Mead drinking follows a hierarchy. The Jarl drinks first, then ship captains, then warriors by age and reputation. Between each round of drinking, they recount parts of the battle. Who struck first, who killed most enemies, who showed courage or cowardice. The war brides remain chained during this part, silent witnesses to their own defeat. Food at these feasts comes from the raid itself. Stolen cattle, grain, ale. The psychological impact matters as much as the calories. The captives watch their own livestock get slaughtered and cooked, their own stores of food distributed to their captors, its dominance made visible. The Annals of Ulster from 941 record a feast after the sack of Clonmacnoise, where the Vikings cooked their victory meal using altar vessels from the monastery as cooking pots. Desecration layered on humiliation. Sexual violence at these feasts isn't random or chaotic. It follows patterns documented across multiple sources. The woman assigned to each warrior becomes his exclusive property for the duration of the celebration. Other men don't interfere. This isn't a free-for-all, it's organized exploitation. The rules matter because they prevent conflicts within the warband. Fighting over women could split the group. Better to establish clear ownership from the start. If you value documented Viking and Norse-era history like this, subscribe. It's the best way to support our work. Also, comment from which city you're hearing this from. This script is researched and factual, using sources from medieval law codes and contemporary chronicles. Now, back to the story. The morning after a victory feast brings practical decisions. Dead captives get thrown overboard or buried in unmarked pits. The archaeological record from Viking Age settlements shows these burial pits clearly. No grave goods, no ritual treatment, just bodies in the ground. Torhild's excavation at Reykjavik in 1994 found one pit with 11 female skeletons showing signs of violent death. Skull fractures, blade cuts to ribs and spine. Carbon dating puts them in the mid-10th century. The ages range from 13 to 26. Surviving war brides face transport to permanent settlements. The lucky ones end up in established Norse colonies where food is steady and winter shelter exists. Iceland takes many war brides in the settlement period from 870 to 930. The land Namabok lists dozens by name, though always as property, never as free women. Alder the Deep-Minded brings 20 Scottish war brides to her estate in Hvamstangi around 900. Their children become thralls, slaves, but they survive. Others get shipped to slave markets. Dublin, Hedeby, and York handle the bulk of this trade. The price records from Dublin's market survive in monastery chronicles. A young war bride in good health brings between 6 and 12 silver pieces, depending on the season and supply. For comparison, a good sword costs 8 silver pieces. A war horse costs 20. Human beings price lower than weapons or livestock. The market operates year-round, but peaks in late summer when raiding season ends. The slave markets don't just sell war brides to other Vikings. Christian kingdoms buy them too. Frankish nobles want household servants who can't easily escape home. Anglo-Saxon lords need workers for remote estates. The trade networks stretch from Greenland to Constantinople. A woman captured in a raid on Ireland might end up in a Byzantine kitchen, a Frankish manor, or a Norwegian farmstead. Distance from home makes escape impossible. Some war brides disappear into legal marriage after years of slavery. Not many, but enough to leave traces in the record. The process requires their owner to free them first, then arrange a proper Christian wedding. This costs money and legal effort. Most owners don't bother, but wealthy jarls occasionally marry their war brides to legitimize children or strengthen alliances. The Orkneyinga saga mentions several such cases. The women rarely get consulted about these arrangements either. Children born to war brides occupy a complex legal position. They're not slaves exactly, but they're not free either. Medieval Scandinavian law codes create a whole category for them. Those born in bonds. They can own property and bear arms, but they can't inherit from their fathers. They can't serve as legal witnesses in major cases. They remain marked by their mothers, captivity for life. The psychological impact of war bride slavery extends beyond the immediate victims. It shapes how Viking society views women generally. Free women in Norse communities know what happens to captured enemies. They see war brides in the households around them. The threat is implicit but constant. Lose a battle, lose your freedom. This knowledge affects marriage negotiations, family alliances, and women's behavior in ways that rarely make it into the sagas. Archaeological evidence from Viking Age settlements confirms the written sources. Slave quarters exist in most major Norse sites. Small, windowless rooms attached to the main hall, iron rings in the walls for chaining occupants, separate cooking areas with cheaper pottery and tools, garbage pits with different bone patterns, showing slaves ate worse cuts of meat and less food overall. The physical remains match the documentary record perfectly. The economic importance of war bride slavery can't be ignored. It funds Viking expansion. Raid profits don't just come from gold and silver, they come from human trafficking. A successful raid on a monastery might yield 20 pounds of silver and treasure and 30 captives worth another 120 pounds at market. The captives often generate more profit than the traditional loot. This makes targeting civilian populations economically rational from a Viking perspective. Legal systems across Europe adapt to handle war bride slavery. Canon law forbids Christians from owning other Christians, but defines captured pagans as fair game. Secular law distinguishes between different types of slaves based on how they were enslaved. War captives have fewer rights than debt slaves or criminals. The legal frameworks legitimize and systematize what starts as battlefield expedients. Some war brides resist, not many survive to tell about it, but the attempts show up in legal records and saga fragments. Halgurdur Hoskuld's daughter kills her captor with a kitchen knife in 968. The Islandingabok mentions her briefly before noting that she was executed for the crime. Resistance means death, but occasionally it succeeds. More often it just means a slower, more painful death, as an example to other captives. The practice spreads beyond Vikings to other groups they interact with. Slavic raiders start copying Viking war bride customs in the 10th century. Norman lords in England continue the tradition after the conquest of 1066. The legal and cultural patterns established during the Viking Age persist for centuries, adapting to new circumstances but maintaining their essential character. Winter changes everything for war brides. Summer raids mean active exploitation and frequent violence. Winter means survival depends on their captors, resources and planning. Food shortages hit slaves first. Firewood gets allocated by status. War brides sleep in the coldest parts of the house, get the worst food, and work the hardest jobs. Many don't survive their first winter in captivity. The weak die, the strong endure. Natural selection operating on human beings. The children of war brides sometimes rise in status through military service. Viking society values fighting ability above birth status in certain circumstances. A thrall-born son who proves himself in battle can earn freedom and property, but he'll never fully escape his origins. The sagas remember bloodlines. Insults about slave ancestry remain effective for generations. Social mobility exists, but it's limited and costly. Medical knowledge about pregnancy and childbirth affects how war brides get treated. Viking women know which herbs prevent conception and which ones cause miscarriage. This knowledge gets shared selectively. Free women might help a war bride avoid pregnancy to spare her additional suffering. Or they might withhold help to maintain their own status advantages. The power dynamics are complex and often cruel. Trade routes determine where war brides end up ultimately. The Volga route to Constantinople favors young women who can survive long river journeys. The western route to Ireland and Britain takes tougher captives who can handle North Sea crossings. Different markets want different types of slaves. Tall, blonde women command premium prices in Mediterranean markets. Dark-haired Celtic captives sell better in Scandinavian towns. Physical appearance becomes a factor in transportation decisions. The documentation for all this comes from multiple independent sources that corroborate each other. Irish annals mention the same raids recorded in Anglo-Saxon chronicles. Archaeological sites match written descriptions of slave quarters and burial practices. Legal codes from different regions show similar patterns adapted to local customs. The evidence converges on a systematic practice that lasted for centuries. But here's what the sagas never mention, and the chronicles barely whisper. In 1987, construction workers building a shopping center in York accidentally broke through into an old stone-lined pit. 37 skeletons, all female, ages 13 to 25. Blade marks on bones, shackle wear on ankle bones. Carbon dating puts them at 950 plus or minus 20 years. Right in the peak period of Viking control over York, the bones show signs of malnutrition, repeated trauma, and violent death. One skeleton wore an amber bead around her neck, probably Scandinavian origin, suggesting she might have been a war bride who tried to go home. The transformation from captive to commodity happened faster than most people realize. Within hours of capture, war brides entered a brutal sorting system that determined their entire future. The process started with basic health checks. Vikings couldn't afford to transport women who would die on the journey. Broken bones, open wounds, or signs of disease meant immediate execution. The healthy ones faced a different kind of examination. Physical attributes mattered enormously in this selection process. Height, hair color, eye color, and body shape all affected market value. The slave traders of Dublin kept detailed records that survive in monastery archives. Tall women with light hair brought premium prices in Mediterranean markets. Short, dark-haired captives sold better locally. Vikings learned these preferences and adjusted their selection accordingly. Beauty wasn't the only factor. Strength and apparent fertility counted more for working slaves. The branding process left permanent marks that archaeologists still find on skeletal remains. Hot iron brands pressed into shoulders or forearms identified ownership and origin. Each raiding crew used different symbols: a raven for followers of Odin, a hammer for Thor's warriors, simple geometric patterns for smaller groups. The Coppergate excavations in York uncovered 17 female skeletons with clear brand marks scorched into bone tissue. The brands stayed visible even after death. Transport logistics shaped how war brides experienced their captivity. Viking ships weren't designed for human cargo. The modifications needed to carry dozens of chained captives required advanced planning and extra equipment. Ironworkers in Norse settlements produced specialized shackles by the hundreds. Archaeological sites across Scandinavia show evidence of mass shackle production. Forges dedicated entirely to restraints and chains. The industrial scale suggests this wasn't occasional opportunism. It was systematic business. The feeding schedule during transport reveals calculated cruelty. War brides got fed once daily, usually spoiled grain porridge or fish scraps. Just enough nutrition to prevent death, but not enough for strength. Dehydration was controlled the same way. Limited water rations kept captives weak and compliant. The sagas mention this strategy explicitly. Weak slaves don't jump overboard. They don't fight guards. They survive transport but arrive broken. Harbor stops along trade routes became nightmare markets where war brides changed hands multiple times. The island of Gotland served as a major transfer point for eastern routes. Archaeological evidence shows slave pens built into the natural rock formations, iron rings hammered directly into stone, drainage channels cut into floors to handle human waste. The remains of these facilities still exist today, hidden in forests that have grown over the ancient trading posts. Weather conditions during transport killed more war brides than violence or starvation. Open Viking ships offered no protection from North Sea storms. Hypothermia struck the chained captives first, since they couldn't move to generate body heat. The Landnámabók mentions several voyages where half the human cargo died from exposure before reaching port. The survivors got sold at full price anyway. Dead slaves were simply written off as transport losses. Different regions developed specialized roles in the war bride trade network. Iceland became known for household slaves who could handle harsh winters. Ireland supplied the most captives due to frequent raiding. Scotland provided women prized for their weaving skills. Each region's captives developed reputations in distant markets. Buyers knew which origins meant which qualities. Human beings reduced to regional brands. The seasonal timing of raids directly related to war bride management. Spring raids meant captives could be worked through summer and sold before winter. Fall raids meant immediate transport south to warmer markets. Winter captives were usually kept locally since long-distance travel was impossible. The Viking calendar revolved around optimizing human trafficking profits alongside traditional loot gathering. Escape attempts by war brides were rare but well documented when they occurred. The saga of the people of Laxardal describes 3 separate escape attempts by Scottish war brides in Iceland around 920. All 3 attempts failed. The punishments were creative and brutal. One woman had her Achilles tendons cut to prevent future running. Another was branded on her face to mark her as dangerous. The third was simply killed as an example. Religious conversion offered no protection for war brides despite Christian teachings about slavery. Viking raiders regularly captured Christian women from monasteries and convents. The religious status meant nothing in practical terms. If anything, Christian captives sometimes brought higher prices because buyers assumed they were educated and could read. Literacy was valuable in household slaves, even if their faith was ignored completely. The psychological conditioning of war brides involved systematic isolation from their origins. Names were changed immediately. Native languages were forbidden. Cultural practices were banned. The goal was to break all connections to their previous identities. Within months, many captives could barely remember their original names. The psychological destruction was as thorough as the physical bondage. Family separation strategies maximized compliance and profit. Mothers were separated from children immediately. Sisters were sold to different buyers. The emotional bonds that might inspire resistance were deliberately severed. The Chronicle of the Kings of Alba mentions this practice specifically in relation to a raid on Iona in 825. 43 women captured, not one kept with relatives. Medical care for war brides was purely economic. Injuries that affected work capacity got treated. Illnesses that reduced market value got attention. Everything else was ignored. The runestones of Gotland include several references to slave healers, captives who had medical knowledge and were kept alive specifically to treat other slaves. Their skills made them more valuable than ordinary war brides. The integration of war bride children into Viking society created a permanent underclass that persisted for generations. These children couldn't inherit property but could accumulate wealth through service. Some became successful traders or craftsmen while remaining legally inferior to freeborn Norse. The social stratification became increasingly complex as the practice continued across centuries. Legal protections for war brides were minimal and mostly related to property damage laws. Killing someone else's slave required compensation to the owner, not justice for the victim. The Gragas law code from Iceland specifies exact compensation amounts. A healthy young female slave was worth 12 ounces of silver if killed by someone other than her owner. The same law allowed owners to kill their own slaves without penalty. Maritime law dealt specifically with war bride transport issues. Ships' captains held legal responsibility for delivering living cargo. Dead slaves meant reduced payment. This created incentives for better transport conditions, but only to the extent that it protected profits. The Berkeboat grave excavations show ships equipped with better ventilation systems for human cargo holds. Business considerations, not humanitarian ones. The war brides weren't just casualties of Viking expansion, they were the fuel that powered it. But here's what changes everything about how we understand this system. In 2019, ground-penetrating radar at the Ribe Trading Center in Denmark revealed a mass grave containing 64 female skeletons, all between ages 15 and 28, all showing evidence of shackleware, all dating to the mid-9th century. But here's the detail that reframes the entire story. 12 of the skeletons wore amber beads consistent with Scandinavian origin, war brides who were Norse women, Vikings enslaving their own people when raids against foreigners proved insufficient. The system had become so profitable that it consumed even the civilization that created it.